Bernard-Henri Levy is France's leading public intellectual. He's the author of more than 30 books, including his groundbreaking work, Barbarism with a Human Face. He's a filmmaker, playwright, and leading thinker and speaker about international politics and ideologies. Well known for his reporting and diplomatic missions to some of the world's most volatile regions, Monsieur Lévy began his career as a reporter during the war between Pakistan and India over Bangladesh. Among his more recent activities, he followed the trail of Daniel Pearl and his murderers in Pakistan, and he visited the sites of some of the world's what's so-called forgotten wars, from Colombia to Sri Lanka and in many other places, including calling for Western involvement in the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya. Most recently, after visiting the front lines in Iraq and Syria, he organized a delegation of Kurdish Peshmerga to meet with French President Hollande to discuss ways to help them fight the Islamic State. In January of this year, he was invited to address the United Nations General Assembly on, in his own words, the renewed advance of the radical inhumanity, the total baseness that is anti-Semitism. We asked him here tonight to share his thoughts on the future of Europe's Jews, how we can be supportive from afar, and how we might bring about change closer to home. Ladies and gentlemen, Bernard-Henri Levy.
Thanks a lot. First of all, I have to apologize for my terrible and pitiful and broken English, but I will try to manage, and you will try to manage too with it. In the title of tonight, the important word is probably, the title is The New Anti-Semitism. The important word is new. It's not anti-Semitism, it is new. Anti-Semitism is an old plague, an old injury, an old hatred. Robert Wistrich said the eldest hatred, but a hatred which has a history, as you know. And the history of anti-Semitism is a history in which anti-Semitism always did as if it tried to find the best way to express, the best way to convince, the best words in order to mobilize, as if it was seeking the means, the tools, the channel of its best efficiency. This is the long history of anti-Semitism. You had a time, a long time, which was the Christian time of Europe, when Christianity was the leading spiritual and political force in Europe, where the best argument for an anti-Semite, and the sole one, was to say, we are against the Jews, not because we hate them, but because we adore the Christ whom they killed and crucified. It was in the name of the Christ, in the name of Christianity, that the killer people who was supposed to be the Jewish people deserved the hatred. There was another step a few centuries after, when the wave changed, when the light moved on the stage of history, when anti-Semitism began to say exactly the opposite. It was the time of enlightenment, when Christ had become a sort of public enemy, when the new tendency was to crush religion, was to build the conditions of free spirit. It was the time of Voltaire, the time of Diderot in France, of the Enlightenment, and then opposite wording, opposite narrative. The Jews deserve to be hated. They are despicable because, not because they killed Christ, if only they had. No, because they invented Christ. because they produce Christ, because they are the root and the stem cell, the stem of this plague of humanity, which is monotheism. It was just the opposite, a new wording, which obtained, which was able to build a new sort of mobilization. Then you had another time, at the end of the 19th century, you had some people who came and who said, at the end of the day, who cares if Jews killed or invented Christ? Who cares about Christ? We are socialists. We love humble, pure and poor workers. We are the true servants of the proletariat. And we observe, said all the French, most of the French socialists of the time of the Dreyfus affair, that the most leading figures of the system which oppresses the Jews, the most leading name, the most vocal persons are Pereire, Fuld, Rothschild. They are Jews. So we have nothing against the Jews, said a third sort of anti-Semitism. We have nothing, we are not anti-Semite. We don't care about Jews, but we care about the humbles and the littles. We care about those who are damned and doomed by the new plutocratic capitalist system, and in the name of them, we, alas, have to say that we have the Jews in the line of our shooting. It was a new anti-Semitism, very different from the two others. Its wording, but also its spirit and its way of convey its message was completely different. Then you had another one in the 20s, 30s of the 20th century, in the years 20s and 30s, which was the time where the sciences of the living, the biology, came to a sort of climax and of excellency, the science of the life, the science of the body. And then began the time of a new narrative, which was the narrative of races, race. Different races, humanity being divided opposite to what the Christianity said. Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism was living under the umbrella of the idea that all men were coming from a single line and root, Adam. No, the new science of the new sciences of the living body said that there was different sort of cranes, different sort of blood, different sorts of ethnicity. Some of them were higher and lower than others, and a new form of anti-Semitism grew up on the ground of this racialist view of the world. This was the anti-Semitism pleading that Jews were a sort of bad race, corrupting the good races, and having to be eradicated if one wanted the positive and glorious races, Aryan race, to prevail. And this was the anti-Semitism which led in particular to Hitler, but not only. So you had many, and I could even quote others. You had a long story of anti-Semitism, which, according to the times, according to the mood of the time, according to the zeitgeist, to the spirit of the moment, changed its way of expressing, of hating, and of killing when it killed. Today, beginning of the 21st century, all these old anti-Semitisms, all these classical forms of the hatred are, if not dead, at least in process of dying or in a sort of process of marginalization. In Europe, as in America, and all around the world, you can, of course, find still some Catholics who believe that Jews have killed the Christ, but they will never make a mass movement. You will never have a huge manifestation in the Bay Area under the banner that the Jews are the ones who crucify the Christ. You can have sects, you can have, but not a wave movement. A movement like as you had in the 18th century, pleading the opposite, again, you still have some free thinkers in Europe. You still have, as we say, some eaters of priests who hate so much religion, who are so atheistic in a sort of rabid way that they hate Jews, but as they hate Christians, and again, it is marginal. It will never make a coagulation of forces able to build a real mass movement. The socialist anti-Semitism, this anti-Semitism who says that the bank, that the financial system is in the hand of the Jews, you still have that, and you had a little of this coming back a few years ago with the financial crisis, but it did not make, at least in Europe, again, as if it was virtually censored by the past, as if there was a sort of common sense of the terrible consequences to which it could lead. It did not make a real movement. And when, in my country, a new Minister of Finance was appointed who was coming from a bank of Mr. Rothschild, it made a little wave, but not so much. And even the case of Madoff in America did not create, as it would have at the time of the Dreyfus affair, or in the 30s, it did not make a huge thing, as if there was the implicit feeling that these sort of arguments had been judged, had been discarded by history. It will never, probably, my bet is that you will not have in the next years or next decades huge crowds of European people shouting in the streets that Jew equal money and that for this they deserve to be killed. It will not happen in a seeable future. This will not happen. The idea of the racist anti-Semitism, same. There is a terrible word of a French writer called Georges Bernanos, who was an anti-Semite, very harsh, but who was also an anti-fascist writer who was against fascism in Spain in 1936 and who was anti-Vichy in the 40s, but he was anti-Semite also. We will discuss of that if you want after. He was in this paradoxical situation. And after the war in 1945, he had a terrible word, a terrible sentence. He said that Hitler had discarded, dishonored anti-Semitism. It was terrible because he implied that anti-Semitism could have had an honor, but that this honor was lost by the excess, by the exaggeration, by the ultimate consequences to which it arrived under Hitler. So Bernanos was a terrible man, but he was right in a way. all these forms of anti-Semitism, all these wordings of the eldest hatred are probably out, discarded, possible to be expressed by a few here and there, but unable to form a real pogromist groups or une fraternité terreur, a terrorist brotherhood, as Jean-Paul Sartre said in one of his most famous books. So, if anti-Semitism has to take birth again, has to continue its dark, terrible, and morbid history, it had to, and he has to find a new way of expressing itself, a new way of hating under the disguise of loving, a new way of hating, having the feeling that it was not only a speech of hate, but it was for highest values, as when they said, we don't hate Jews, we love Christ, and so on. Anti-Semitism is, since World War II, in the situation to have to either not survive, or, if it has to survive, to find a new dispositif, a new organization of its wording. An organization and a wording which can match with our time, which can match with its values, which can match with the creeds of the current time. And this reshaping, this rewording, I have the conviction that we are in the situation now, at the time where we speak, in the situation where, after a long process, after some hesitations, after some dialectical movements, the wording is probably at the edge of being ready and ready-made. This wording, which we begin to hear in Europe, at least, but I will speak of America later. This wording, which we begin to hear, which is under the eyes of the eldest of us, making itself since a few decades and arriving to its achievement today, relies on three big pillars, relies on three simple propositions. My conviction is that the only way today to be seriously anti-Semite, to be seriously anti-Semite means to be anti-Semite with the conviction that it is not only by a sort of wickedness, but that it is for a sort of good of general humanity. The only way relies and can only relies on three arguments. The new anti-Semitism of today, which is shaping itself since a few years or decades, says, number one, we hate the Jews. The Jews deserve to be hated, not because they are Jews, but because they are solidar, they are friendly with, they are supportive of a state which we are obliged to say that is a criminal state, illegitimate, having no right to be settled where it is, which is the state of Israel. The first conviction of an anti-Semite of today, The first way he has to express the old hatred without falling under the spell and the condemnation of being a racist or a stupid bigot or all these forms which are dishonored, as Bernard says, is to say that Israel is a bad country, is maybe a fascist country, behaving in front of its adversaries in a dishonest way, and that a community of women and men who feel friendly with this state deserve to be depicted as hateable people. This is the argument number one. It is the anti-Zionist argument. Not that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, but that anti-Semitism cannot be something else today than anti-Zionist. Either anti-Semitism will not take rebirth, anti-Semitism will die gently, or it will marry with the glove of the anti-Zionism. It is the only way it has to express. Let's imagine now that this state of Israel, in order to be founded, in order to be built, in order to legitimate itself, has invented, exaggerated, or over-exploited what any people should have most sacred and saint, which is its own martyrdom. Let's imagine that the Jews who support Israel did it by producing the hoax, the myth, or at least the religion, the worship of Holocaust. Let's imagine that the supporters of Israel are cynical enough to traffic their own memory, and instead of nourishing a silent sorrow, to overstress and over-express it in order to support more strongly this guilty state, there is here a reason number two to hate or to dislike at least these people. The second pillar of the new anti-Semitism, the second only possible channel for anti-Semitism to spread fire again in the hearts and in the brains, is the denial of Holocaust, or if not the denial, the revision of Holocaust. Now, let's imagine that those people who happen to be Jews, says the new anti-Semite, they happen to be Jews. I have nothing against Jews as such, but these people who support this criminal state, who do it by inventing, exaggerating, or overstressing their own martyrdom. Let's imagine then that by doing so, they overshadow, they impose silence, they put in the darkness other martyrdoms, other sufferings, other miseries of other peoples, but which, because of them, and because of their way of invading the public space with the memory of their deads, disappear from the scope of history. Let's imagine, says the new anti-Semite, that there is not enough room in a heart for two sorrows. Let's imagine that there is a struggle for life, also for the deads, and that you have to choose, that humanity has to choose between being faithful to the memory of the Jews or faithful to the memory of the African-American or French-American inheritor of slavery. Let's imagine that there is a choice. Let's imagine that there is a competition. Let's imagine that there is a competition of memories and of victimhood. The third crime of the Jews, the third reason why they could deserve to be hated, is that they waged and won this battle, and that they spread a mantle, a coat of darkness upon all these victims which are not theirs. The third argument of the new anti-Semitism is the argument taken out of this terrible idea, but which is a modern one, of the war of victims and of the competition of memories. If you put the three together, anti-Zionism, denial of Holocaust, competition of memories, if you take these three threads, they are like the three devices of another nuclear bomb, a moral one. If they are edited together, if they are assembled together, if they touch each other, if they are thought in a whole way, then I think we can see, we can attend a huge burst comparable to what we saw in the 30s in Europe or at the end of the 19th century on the basis of the racist argument, the socialist argument, or the Christian argument before. This is the situation of today. To be an anti-Semite nowadays in France, to be at the edge of mobilizing, organizing a real demonstration of people hating Jews with self-confidence, with the feeling to do bad but to do good also, with the feeling of a certain form of legitimacy and innocence, supposes one of those three, or the three, or those three arguments together. If these three propositions happen to connect with each other, if they happen to make a sort of node, this node will be a bowl of fire having some effects comparable to what we saw in the past. Anti-Semitism will take rebirth or not. If it takes rebirth, it will be only on the basis, more or less, of this narrative which I am describing very quickly. At which point are we today? This is the schema, this is the paradigm. This is in the sky of ideas, and unfortunately, these are also ideas. And there is also a dark sky or a hell but it's the same. It is the same for these sort of ideas. In the hell of ideas, you have this pattern which is taking form. Now, in reality, at which point are we? In France, in Europe in general, I think that we are at the edge of the nuclear step. As we say for Iran, Iran is at a few years. The specialist says that Iran is a few years from the nuclear step. I don't know, le seuil nucléaire, le seuil du nucléaire. It's the same for anti-Semitism. We are very close to the step, very close to the node becoming a ball. There is in France a real mass movement which is expressing itself through the internet, but also in the streets, when there is an occasion which allows it, as the war in Gaza recently, last summer. You have, for the first time since the Second World War, you have today in France the possibility of big crowds of people coming down into the streets and screaming, "We hate Jews," but within their head, the three arguments I was depicting very quickly. You have in France today the possibility of that. You have in France today not only the possibility, but the fact that for the first time since centuries, it did not even happen in the 30s. It did not even happen in the 30s. It did not even happen at the time of Affaire Dreyfus. You have some French citizens who are killed, who have been killed because they are Jews, and more or less, even if it was in the disorganized brain and stupid mind of illiterate people, under the arguments more or less which I described very quickly. You had a few months ago some average French Jews who were just making their shopping for Shabbat and who were killed because they were conceived in the way more or less which I described. Before that, you had 3 years before in a French city of Toulouse, a little girl who was taken by the hair and shot dead by a bullet because she was Jew again, and Jew in the sense which I said. And before that, you had 7 or 8 years ago, a young French guy called Ilan Halimi, who was kidnapped, who was kept secretly in a basement in the core of a neighborhood of Paris, who was tortured to death, who was burnt alive, and who was left dead because he was Jew on a railway quay. So we are in this situation. And we are in the situation also, so demonstrations, deaths, which we did not have in France in the 30s, and we have also this strange, new, and when you think about it, terrible situation that if you have some kids, if you are French and have some kids, and if you want to send them to a Jewish school, they go to a school which is highly protected by the best policemen, elite policemen in France. If you are a Jew and if you pray, you go to synagogues who are transformed, who have to be transformed into fortress. A synagogue today is guarded as a fortress. you have some, if I was speaking in France, as I do here today, about the same topics, the room where I would speak would be put under high protection by very brave, courageous, and highly professional French official policemen. So this is the situation of France, which is not comfortable, which is not a good situation at all, because of what I describe, because of this general idea that Jews are again guilty of supporting Israel, because of a trafficked memory and overshadowing the memory and the mourning of other peoples, namely the Palestinians. Because of this climate, Jews in France are in a process of being transformed into a living ghetto again. On the other side, we are in a situation which is far from being hopeless and which is far from being lost by the Jews and by those who believe that the presence of the Jews in France is priceless. And if you compare the situation of France today to the situation in the 30s, there is at least 3 differences which make that the situation is much better today than it was in the 30s. That the situation is far from desperate as it was in the 30s. You have 3 main differences at least which make that, as far as I am concerned, I deeply believe that the time is not to live but to fight, that the result of the fight will not be a defeat but a victory, and that these new anti-Semites will be defeated because of 3 big reasons. Reason number 1, you have this wave of new anti-Semitism. You have these deaths which we did not have in the 30s, but we have this wave of anti-Semitism, contrary to the wave of the 30s, have no vocal, big authority expressing itself, expressing this wave. In the 30s, you had big spokesmen, great voices, alas, giving their talent, giving their genius to the dirty and disgusting anti-Semitism. You had Louis-Ferdinand Céline, you had Jean Giraudoux, you had a lot of big, prominent, respectable writers who gave them their authority to this mob which was preparing the worst. Today, difference number 1, and it makes a real difference, you have none of that. You could not quote one thinker, one writer, one moral authority who has made a real step in this direction. We have some people whom I would even not quote here, or if you know them, Dieudonné and so, but Dieudonné is really nobody. He's a dummy compared to Louis-Ferdinand Céline. The Jews of the 30s who had against them Louis-Ferdinand Céline were really in a bad situation. If you believe, as I think we have to believe, in the force of spirit, of words, of literature, of philosophy, to have against us someone of the value of Louis Ferdinand Céline was really bad news. Today, nothing equivalent. There are a few anti-Semitic writers in France, but you don't know them. You don't need to know them. They don't deserve to be known by the valiant people of San Francisco. Difference number two, which explains that I think that this anti-Semitism may be defeated. Difference number two. In the 30s, it was not only a wave in the depth of the society and at the grassroots of France. It reached the summit. It corrupted, the wave corrupted the state and the elite. You have to know that in 1936, 37, 38, you had some MPs who were enraged anti-Semites. What Dieudonné is saying today with penalty of law on the internet was said even worse in the French parliament. And the name of Dieudonné at this time was a man who was nearly elected president of the French Assembly in 1936. You had some ministers, some secretaries of the government who were anti-Semites. One of them is called Jean Giraudoux. He's very well known because he is a great writer, also a great writer of theater. He was minister of the government of Daladier, and he, in various circumstances and in a book, he described his fellow Jewish citizens as dirty, savage people invading by their bloody and bad blood the sane and healthy French hospitals of which they had to be expelled. He was minister of French government. You had some high authorities in the mayors of some of our biggest cities who were enraged anti-Semites. Today, in the France of the 2013, 14, 15, nothing comparable to that. And even the opposite, when the Prime Minister of France, who was at this time Minister of Domestic Affairs, decides that Mr. Dieudonné, who is at the edge of assembling the 3 nuclear devices, has to be forbidden because what he says falls under the penalty of law, there is a consensus in the whole political class. None of his opponents plays games with that, and there is a sort of general agreement. Not one word was expressed against the decision of Manuel Valls. I don't say that to praise this or that, just to describe a situation of my country, and it is true all over Europe. There is still today, and this makes again a clear difference, a taboo against anti-Semitism, whatever could be his new narrative and his new wording. And the third difference, which makes me relatively optimistic in spite of this atmosphere of fortress for the Jew, besieged fortress, despite of the deaths, despite of the demonstration where I hear that I should go away from France, is the Jew themselves. Opposite to the 30s, when they were sort of shame Jews, shy Jews, believing that it was impossible to be French and Jews, living their double belonging, double allegiance as a fate and a malediction in the 30s. There is none of that today. And there is, I would not say a pride, but I would say a self-affirmation of French Jews, which makes them awaken, aware of the danger, armed, having the good weapons to face it and to reply. And there is today in France and in Europe a reply organized more and more, vocal, highly vocal, against these arguments of the new anti-Semitisms. So the situation of my country and of Europe, I'm sorry, but I cannot give a very clear response. Is it unbearable, or is it still, anti-Semitism is still beatable? It is in between, and my feeling is that it will be beaten. Last word, before engaging the dialogue with the floor. Last point. I'm speaking about France since 40 minutes. I would just like to say that if I am right, if the three pillars of the new anti-Semitism are what I say, if anti-Semitism will not be or be relying on these three arguments, anti-Zionism, denial of Holocaust, and competition of victims, battle for who will be the king of suffering, if these are the three arguments, of course, France is a stage for this battle, but it is a world battle. I don't know any part of the world of today which is out of this game, including United States of America. If you look at this competition of victims, if you get into this very strange and stupid way of seeing the things, if you get into this stupid idea that you have to choose between being solidar with Jews and solidar with blacks, between bearing in yourself the sorrow and the mourning of the Holocaust and bearing in yourself also the souvenir and the mourning of the slavery, there is one country, which is America, where this idea that you have to choose was expressed first. It is here. Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, today Farrakhan. What do they say? On what do they build their theory except on that? Except on this idea that opposite to what seemed to be in the 60s, opposite to the false ideas, they say, of a solidarity between victims, which was the picture of the 60s, where the Jews were at the front line of the battle for the civic rights. Mr. Farrakhan, through the books he financed, through the lectures he gives, through the rumors he spreads about the responsibility of the Jews in the transatlantic slavery and so on, feeds this idea of a necessary choice and of a new battle of memories between minorities. So this idea, if it is one of the pillars of the new anti-Semitism, the paradigm, the pattern is French and is American, unfortunately, also. You are not sheltered from that. If a pillar is the denial of Holocaust, if one of the pillars of the new anti-Semitism is to accuse the Jews to make a setup of an imaginary crime, or partly imaginary, which is set up and built in order to serve the interest, in particular, of Israel, you have a strong current in France of denial of Holocaust, but you have a strong current also in America. You have in Los Angeles. I don't want to quote them, they don't deserve, but you have a few of these so-called academies with this very strange way they have to express with an appearance of scientificity, with an appearance of science, of scholarship, and so on, which feeds and fuels this idea of denial of Holocaust. Anti-Zionism, the idea that Israel is guilty by essence, that it deserves to be opposed more than Sudan, guilty of hundreds of thousands of dead, that he has to be fought against Israel more than China occupying Tibet, and so on. America is again, I'm sorry, but one of the possible fatherland, one of the stages where these anti-Zionist ideas are taking shape today, including with the BDS campaign, which is a very strange campaign at the end of the day if you look really at it. BDS is strong in France, but is strong also and probably stronger in America and especially in your city. So one could, I would be tempted to say that maybe the situation in France seems more dramatic, and it is more dramatic, because there is blood. The blood was spread. Ilan Halimi and Hyper Cacher. The situation is certainly more dramatic, more tragic, but my deep belief is that, unfortunately, the battle is common, the stage is won, and we all are on the same boat, the co-citizens of Daniel Pearl, the American brave hero beheaded because he was Jew and American in Pakistan, and the co-citizens of Ilan Halimi, this poor young Jewish guy who was a sort of Daniel Pearl, but in Paris. Same boat, same battle, same arguments in front of us, and I feel, I deeply believe, a victory that we will win together. These were my opening remarks. Now I will be happy to reply to your questions.
If you have a question, we'd like to ask you to please wait till we come to you and acknowledge you. Thank you. Okay.
The first question will be on your right here.
You carefully avoided any mention of the large Muslim population in France. I would like you to address that.
The question is not Muslim. We have a large population of Muslims, but we have in France a huge majority of Muslims among these Muslims who are not anti-Semites, who don't believe that Holocaust is an invention, who don't believe that Israel is a fascist state, and who don't believe that our insistence on our dead prevents them to mourn their own dead. There is a big majority of Muslims who are not on this page at all. But the point in France is that in their name, in the name of the Palestinian cause, but an abstract Palestinian cause, which has nothing to do with the real Palestinians, you have these arguments. You have this narrative which is widespread. But if you look at the demonstrations in Paris, you cannot see, of course, if one is Muslim or not, but you have the feeling, you hear at least the slogans, you have the feeling that those who are trying again anti-Semitism, they come from all parts of the French society. They come from all scopes of public opinion, but on the ground, in particular, of the Palestinian cause, which they pretend to be the most vocal advocates, as when the socialists of 1898 made some manifestos in France in name of all the workers, saying that they were against Alfred Dreyfus and against the Jewish bank because they loved the workers, but the workers were not necessarily on board. So the question is the ideas. The question is the pattern. It is not a particular class of the society, or even worse, it is not a particular origin of the French citizens which make the difference. I believe that this anti-Semitism relying on anti-Zionism, denial of Holocaust, competition of victims, will work exactly the same, which have as many advocates, even if there was no minority of French citizens having some roots in the Maghreb. Maybe not exactly, but this is not what makes really the difference.
The next question is in the middle.
I may have misunderstood you, but do you describe someone who was a Zionist, who loves Israel and believes in the state for the Jews, but disagrees very strongly with the current government of Israel and their lack of support for the two-state solution? Do you call them an anti-Semite?
I call an anti-Semite someone who dreams the disappearance of Israel. I call an anti-Semite someone who has the project of a one-state solution under Palestinian flag. I call an anti-Semite someone who dreams of an ethnic cleansing in the Middle East, of which the Jews would be the targets and the victims. This, for me, is anti-Semite. I call an anti-Semite someone who thinks that Jews have no possible place, have no authorized presence in this part of the world. This, for me, is anti-Semitism. After that, to discuss, not only to discuss, to be strongly opposed to this or that aspect of the policy of that or this government, this is a rule in civilized world. And when democracies are regarded, are concerned, as it is in Israel, Israel, which is a great democracy, affords is able to stand a strong critique of its government. And by the way, one of the biggest virtues of Israel, one of the reasons which makes the democracy of Israel rather admirable is that in spite of 67 years of virtual war, of state of emergency, of national anxiety, most of the democratic values have been maintained. Look at what happened in my country during the Algerian War, in your country under the time of George W. Bush Patriot Act I. How after a few years, Algeria or terrorism, after a few years of state of emergency, the citizens begin to accept that one could take some liberties with the liberties. Strangely enough, in Israel, of course, you have some people behaving badly. Of course, you have some words which are expressed and which are not decent. But the general framework, the state of the laws, the democratic ethics is untouched by this continuous state of emergency. So to be, I can have, and I have, strong reserves, all my life I have had, against some of the governments of Israel. But none of these reserves can make me forget and consider as neglectable what I just said. This solidness of the Israeli democracy in spite of this state of terror, of this state of threat. I go to Israel often, as you may go. There is, since I go to Israel since 1967, I never saw Israel in a time of peace. And I never saw any country having to face this state of emergency and remaining faithful to not only to its values, but to its institutions, as Israel does.
Thank you. Next question on this side.
Thank you. How much of the anti-Semitism in France do you think owes to the fact that it appears that the French economy has been in stagnation, whereas Israel's has been booming and thriving?
Close to zero. Anti-Semitism, jihadism, fascism have less than one thing generally, less to see with economics. It has to do with passion, with deep questions of identity, with uncertainty on the social link about the values. It has very little to do with economy. And I really believe that if we want to understand these phenomena, and not only to understand, but to fight them, we have to try to give to these sort of explanations, economy, sociology, the part which they deserve, which is really minimal. When you say, for example, this was the case after attacks on Hypercacher and on Charlie Hebdo in January. When I hear that the killers are poor people whose murders are the effects and the products of their social discomfort or precarity, it's an insult to all the people who are in discomfort, to their own brothers or cousins who, by the way, protested very strongly and stronger than I do myself here, and who did not go into terrorism. So my deep belief is that this is, as Spinoza says, a shelter for ignorance. If we don't want to understand, if you don't want to face the reality, then we say that. It is the economical crisis, it is the sociology.
Next question here in the back.
Hi, I'm certainly the only French Jews in this room, but I have a very, no, there is several, great. So I really want to understand how you can measure and be so affirmative about this big majority of peaceful Muslims and avoid totally talking about the roots of the new anti-Semitism being mainly in the Muslim world. How can you do that?
It is not, it is in the Muslim world, yes, partly, but why do you say mainly? Look at San Francisco, the Bay Area, the BDS campaign, which is truly, who has to do with what we are talking today, which has to do with this harsh anti-Zionism, which has to do with the delegitimation of Israel, who has to do with the idea that Israel has no space in the Middle East, are the militants of Stanford, the militants of the campus where these ideas are stemming and growing, Muslims? Mainly Muslims? What does has
I'm
Islam?
not talking about America, I'm talking about France. I am French and I left France for this specific reason. So I want to understand how you can take the measure, the exact measure, and be so sure about the quantity of Muslims who are so peaceful. Is it by the way they support Israel? Is it by the way they show their support when something bad happened to Jews? Is it by the way there is writers or organization of Muslims supporting the Jews? What is your way to take this measure?
No, I don't take any measure. I did not tell you that I had an instrument to measure it. I did not say that. I said that if we want to treat the phenomenon seriously, we have to stand on ideas, not on sociology. If we speak of ideas, they are never limited to a category of population. Number one. Number two, do they stand with Jews where Jews are attacked? Madame, you know as well as myself that when Jews were attacked, when Jews was Ilan Halimi, when Jews are attacked in Toulouse, when Jews were attacked last summer during the war in Gaza, the Muslim did not go in the streets, but the non-Muslim French did not do it either. There was nobody to defend Jews in France last summer when synagogues were attacked, when shops allegedly owned by Jews were attacked and vandalized. There was nobody, not only non-Muslim, no one. If there was, wait a minute, a mobilization on January 11 of whole French society, it was a mobilization in favor of Charlie Hebdo and Hypercacher. If it had been only an attack on Hypercacher, then I think that this big trend, which is going in all French society, saying that the Jews have the three guiltiness which I told you, would have prevailed, that there would have been the unsaid feeling that, unsaid and unexpressed, even unconsciously, that there was something which they deserved in a way, and nobody would have come in the street, not only the Muslims. Not only. Who came in the street for Ilan Halimi?
Okay, we're going to move on to the next question. This is, unfortunately, we're running low on time, so this is going to be the last question for the evening.
Oh, sorry. Let's stay with delegitimization, and I think you said something that was very profound. If it's just the Jews, they are alone, and their co-citizens, whether they be Muslim or Christian, tend to be apathetic. But let's go back to the cynicism of the French government at the United Nations, voting for every resolution against Israel, providing billions and billions of euros to terrorist organizations because of payments for oil. Can you talk about the cynicism of the French government officially in the continuous delegitimization of Israel as a state that has the right to both defend and attack for its citizens in a way that has been for 40 years since de Gaulle decided to do the embargo from '67, and the French refused to support the rearming of Israel during '73, and the cynicism of supporting terrorism as long as it wasn't in France, and if it was in Israel. The French government has continuously sold Israel down the river, at least in terms of the way we see it. Can you talk about that in terms of the official French positions against Israel being a sovereign Jewish state with the right to defend itself?
I'm sorry. I don't want to enter in a detailed politics. It would not be decent to do that here. But you cannot say that. You cannot say French government in general fueled some terrorist organization in general, voted constantly against it. It is not against Israel. It is not true. It is not true. And we have in France a current government which President and Prime Minister are deeply concerned by Israel, are deeply opposed to this tendency which exists in the French diplomacy, but they are not on this page at all. And you speak about '73, you speak about de Gaulle, maybe, of course, but time has passed. And it would be unfair to say, it is not true, that the last presidents of France have been, and what do you mean by fueling a terrorist organization? What is that? No. You have a problem with Europe, maybe, but I don't know what you mean by France financing what? Hamas? Hezbollah? Is France financing Hamas? Seriously, no. You cannot say that. You have in France, as everywhere, a real diplomatic battle between, this is true, but you have that in America also. Wait. You have already voices. We were talking before about the book of Meir Shamer and Walt, who are exactly saying that America is devoting too much attention, too much money, too much diplomacy to Israel, regarding its real importance on the map of the world and considering the interest of America. This book was a bestseller, but it was whipped out. It did not make French policy, American policy. In France, we have a man, I will not name him here, who made a note to the president of France of today, telling him that the support to Israel was too high cost, that it was unreasonable if it was compared to the mutual importance of Israel and other countries. The man was expelled from Socialist Party. He was expelled for the majority. He is considered as a black sheep. So things are not as simple, neither in America nor in France. We will have in France, and you will have in America, some people who will say, certainly, why are we taking so much in consideration this little state which prevents us to make a good business with these big oil monarchies? And so, probably you will have that. You have already. And you have tough politicians, good presidents who, because Israel has strong friends and strong lobbies supporting her, Israel, you have strong presidents who refuse this language of cowardness and of narrow interest. It is the same in France. We have the same battle between values and realpolitik. For the moment, frankly, I would be the first one to say it. When I have the feeling that my country acts badly, and it happened often, I'm the first one to say it. On the question of Israel, you cannot say that today. You cannot say that France has a bias anti-Israel and in favor of its enemies. Last question. Last one. Okay? Yeah? Yeah? Yeah?
Come out here, please.
Yeah, I hear you.
No, please.
So you stated several times that you think this time the Jews, we will win this battle of anti-Semitism. But you have not yet told us what you believe the tools and the weapons to be in this battle. Could you take a moment to share your thoughts on that?
To win the battle does not mean to eradicate anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not a virus or a microbe which can be eradicated. There will always be some anti-Semitism in France and in America, and in France probably more. But to win the battle means to keep it in minority, to be stronger than it. This is the target, to be stronger in this arm wrestling battle between friends of democracy, therefore of Israel, and anti-Israeli, therefore friends of tyranny and fascism. We need to be stronger. So how to be stronger? There is two ways. Number one, to assert, to affirm, to stress our own values. I said before that the mistake of the generation of our fathers or grandfathers was to believe that if they were shadowy enough, if they were shy enough, if they made themselves being forgotten, they will be forgotten by the bad devil of anti-Semitism. It did not happen this way. The truth is probably the opposite. The only way to defeat the beast is to stand against it, to assert our own values, and to do it with wiseness, calm, and pride. This is the first way. And this is what happens today in France. If I compare the France of today to the France of my teenager times, it's night and day. In my teenager age, to be a Jew in France was nearly unexpressible, impossible to say, to word. Today, I see the generation of my children. There is an affirmation of Jewishness. There is a self-confidence and a trust in oneself, which is a way to fight. The other way to fight is to confront the arguments, is to reply methodically, one by one to them. I told you that the three pillars are what I said. Okay, let's reply to those who say, who deny Holocaust. Let's reply as we do already, by facts, by showing in the schools the movie of Claude Lanzmann, Shoah, by punish and exclude the teachers who are not brave enough to impose it even when some pupils refuse. Competition of victims. Let's not only plead that a heart is wide enough to receive and host 2, 3, many faithfulness, but let's just look at the recent history. If you look at the last 30 years, which were not, unfortunately, there was some big mass murders. There was at least one new genocide in Rwanda. You had some massive war crimes in Bosnia. You had maybe a genocide. There is a discussion in South Sudan and in Darfur. The fact is that those who gave the alarm, those who rang the bell, those who first smelt the characteristic smell of the beast, those who immediately understood that something terrible was going on, which might turn into something like a genocide, were those who had the Holocaust in their heart. This is a fact. To fight anti-Semitism is to stress this fact, to put in the light the fact that this is history of the last decades, without not only Jews mainly, but not only, without those who worshipped the remembrance of the dead of Holocaust, without those who thought that there was a duty of memory of the Holocaust, there would have been no mobilization for the Tutsis in Rwanda, or for the besieged people in Sarajevo, or for the Darfuri people killed by Mr. al-Bashir. So, to fight anti-Semitism is to say that, to remind it, to repeat it. Israel, a criminal state. Israel, a fascist state. Israel, the essence of crime. Come on. Is it so difficult to say strongly what I just said before, that it is the only example which we know of a democracy under attack continuously since 70 years and which nevertheless never abandoned its value? Is it so difficult to say that it is the only, or one of the only, of the sole, really multi-ethnic, therefore democratic countries in the world? I don't know, maybe America, but I don't know any case in Europe of a country built with Europeans and Americans, Russians and Africans, black and white, a sort of global country of composed people, inhabited, made of people coming from all the parts of the world and making a country. Is that a fascist, obsessed by purity country? What are we talking about? Is it so uneasy to say that? We have in France some problems with some of our minorities. We have in France some problems, as you had in America in the 60s, and as sometimes you seem to maybe to have again some people with some of our neighborhoods, riots. In Israel, there is a way of dealing with the minorities, and sometimes minorities who are really, who might be considered in France, I can tell you, very problematic. A way of dealing with that which is rather exemplary. The Arab minority having 16 MPs at the parliament, having an absolute freedom of speech and even the freedom of criticizing, undermining the very values which make the ground of the state. I never saw that in France. And it would be very difficult to conceive it in any European country. So, to fight anti-Semitism is to say that. To fight anti-Semitism is to say, for example, last example, there is a question of political theory, question of school, une question de cours. How do we do a democracy? Is a democracy able to be built from overnight? Of course not. Look at Russia, look at China, look at Libya, how difficult, look at France, how it is difficult to build a democracy. In France, it took 90 years. In Libya, it's very difficult. In Russia, it is worse and worse. Very difficult to build a democracy. This is true. And political theory, democracy is not Messiah. It does not come all of a sudden. It is not made overnight. One exception. Israel in 1948. People, again, who came from all over the world. Some had an experience of democracy. A lot did not have any experience of democracy. A lot came from Arab countries which were as unaware of what democracy is as the Libyan people today. A lot came from Russia, which were under tyranny since decades, and so on. And in a glance, in one day, as a sort of secular miracle, there was this exceptionalism, this exception of a democracy built contemporary, at least, of its own institution and decision. So this has to be said. This has to be opposed to those who delegitimize Israel, even if they are not Muslim, even if they are human rights militants of the Bay Area of San Francisco. This has to be said on and on. This is a reply. This is a way of resisting. This is a way to fight. And if it is said, if the fight is waged properly, we will win.
Thank you very much, Bernard-Henri Levy. And thank you all for coming.